My name is Daniel Cross, and this is the story of how one humiliating moment in a fluorescent-lit conference room became the spark that burned an empire down. It began on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other cheap hotel-grade coffee steaming in the back of the room, the buzz of tired conversation, the HR team wearing those stiff smiles that never quite reach their eyes. 70 of us had been summoned into the conference center, and no one really knew why. Then the CEO clipped on his lav mic, beaming like he was about to announce a baby shower. Today, he chirped, "We celebrate bold new beginnings." I already felt my stomach sink. Corporate speeches rarely begin with the word celebrate unless it's masking a funeral. And I was right. We've made the difficult decision to streamline our operations. That one word streamline echoed in my skull. It's the kind of word executives use when they want to dress up cruelty in business casual. My name was the fourth one read aloud. Daniel Cross, 15 years of service. Thank you, but we must refresh our talent stack. The words didn't even sound real. I'd spent a decade and a half patching every hole, carrying every compliance risk, making sure federal auditors didn't slice this company apart. And now, with one line on a PowerPoint slide, I was obsolete. There was applause, actual applause. Not warm applause, not grateful applause, just the robotic clapping of people too scared not to follow along. One person muttered, "You'll bounce back from what being gutted in front of my peers, having my life's work reduced to a disposable bullet point." I could feel my ears ringing, my hands going cold the way they always do when something inside me is about to snap. But I didn't scream, I didn't argue, I didn't beg. Instead, I stood nodded once like I was being excused from jury duty and walked toward the side door. That's where the hook really sharpens. Because this story doesn't end with me leaving in silence, it begins there. You see, while the CEO smirked on stage, while HR clutched their branded stress balls, they had no idea that the paperwork guy they just dismissed wasn't just shuffling forms. I was the designated responsible officer, the only legally recognized authority tied to every single federal and defense contract this company relied on. Without my active designation, the whole tower of contracts wasn't just fragile, it was already collapsing. And in that moment, as I walked down the hallway toward the elevator, I wasn't broken. I wasn't even angry. I was calculating. The elevator doors opened with a chime, and I stepped inside, pressing the button for the lobby. Alone, I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and logged into the compliance portal. My thumb pressed the biometric scan. The system recognized me immediately. The form appeared 1916B Responsible Officer Status Change. I stared at the screen, my pulse steadying my mind clearer than it had been in years. The text was simple. Submission will initiate stop work order on all contracts requiring active compliance oversight. Confirm. This wasn't sabotage. This wasn't revenge. This was the law. Federal regulation. Ironclad. The same rules I had upheld for 15 years without fail. The same rules they had ignored when they treated me as disposable. The elevator slowed. The doors began to part. And with one calm breath, I pressed confirm. The action was instantaneous, invisible, and irreversible. By the time my shoes touched the marble lobby floor, the company's lifeline was already bleeding out. But here's the part you need to understand. I didn't do it in rage. I didn't do it for petty triumph. I did it because after all those years of saving them, I realized the power had always been mine. They just never noticed until I walked away. That was the moment this story truly began, the moment I shifted from pawn to player, from background fixer to the only person holding the detonator. And if you think that elevator ride was dramatic, wait until you see what happened next. The lobby air was cooler than the conference room, and yet I felt heat rising inside me. I walked past reception cardboard box tucked under my arm like a joke, the company logo printed on the side, as if to remind me who owned what. The receptionist gave me that awkward half smile, the kind you give a condemned man on his way out. I didn't return it. The revolving doors spat me onto the sidewalk, the city alive with its usual chaos, honking cabs, the smell of hot pretzels from a cart, a man yelling into his Bluetooth like the world owed him attention. To anyone passing by, I looked like just another corporate casualty carrying a box of leftovers. But in my pocket was the one action that would change everything. Confirmation submitted, stop work order activated. I didn't walk fast. I didn't look over my shoulder. I simply made my way to the parking garage, every step measured like I had rehearsed it. Because truthfully, I had. Not the firing, no, never that humiliation. but I had always known the clause existed. Always understood that if the company ever turned on me, I wasn't powerless. I was the lock on the vault, and without my key, everything inside froze. That cardboard box they gave me inside were the cliches: family photo, in a frame, 2 pens, a plant clipping. HR thought they'd stripped me down to nothing, but they hadn't taken what mattered. They couldn't. My designation was inked into federal systems backed by statute enforced by law, and the law doesn't bend for LinkedIn mascots who call themselves visionary CEOs. I reached my car and set the box gently in the passenger seat. Then I leaned back, eyes closed, and listened to the city for a moment. That's when the realization sank in. I didn't need to say a word in that conference room. I didn't need to shout or beg. My silence was louder than any speech I could have made. Because while they applauded their golden boy CEO for refreshing talent, the countdown had already begun. In less than 24 hours, every contract tethered to my name would stall. Every project that kept them afloat would grind to a halt. And every hour of inaction would cost them $100,000. The fines would mount faster than they could spin a press release. I started the engine, not in a rush, not even angry anymore, just steady. There's a strange clarity that comes when you've been underestimated for so long. They thought I was invisible. They thought I was just paperwork, and that's why they didn't see it coming. You know, I've told this story enough times to know what people are thinking right now. Would you have done the same? Could you have walked out calm, pushed that button, and let the company choke on its arrogance? That's the real question, isn't it? And before I go further, let me ask you this directly. Where are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments below. Because stories like this aren't just entertainment, they're reflections. We've all been in rooms where someone tried to strip us of our worth. If you've ever felt invisible, like your loyalty didn't matter, this channel is where we turn that silence into strength. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next time a story like this flips the power script. Back in that parking garage, I turned off my phone. HR had already sent me a separation summary and a feedback survey. Imagine that, asking for feedback on being discarded. I deleted it without hesitation. Let them enjoy the silence. Let them try to untangle the knots I had once kept smooth. The truth is, I wasn't leaving broken. I was leaving armed with knowledge, with leverage, and with the certainty that they had just made the biggest mistake of their careers. They thought they fired an employee. They didn't realize they'd severed the keystone holding their empire in place. As I pulled out of the garage, sunlight spilling onto the windshield, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom. The kind of freedom that comes not from quitting, not from running, but from finally recognizing your own value. I wasn't running from anything. They were running out of time. And as the city blurred past, I knew the story wasn't finished. It was only beginning. The real storm was waiting just over the horizon, and I was the one who had set it in motion. The elevator ride had lasted only seconds, but the aftershock was seismic. By the time I reached the street, the compliance system was already humming quietly, executing the order I had set in motion. One line of digital ink had flipped the switch from business as usual to full-on crisis, and nobody in that conference hall even knew it yet. That's the cruel beauty of systems like these. They don't explode with fireworks. They suffocate in silence. The company's servers would keep spinning, employees would keep typing, but behind the glass, the oxygen was already gone. Every federal and defense contract was now flagged with one fatal phrase: stop work order pending responsible officer reinstatement. Think about that for a second. A $700 million corporation with sprawling teams in 3 time zones, hundreds of engineers, entire divisions devoted to future resilience, and all of it tethered to one name: my name. That was no accident. I had spent years stitching myself into the DNA of compliance because I knew what kind of executives sat at the top. The kind who cared about stock photos of diversity more than the law. The kind who called it paperwork until the paperwork turned to chains. As I drove out of the garage, my phone buzzed with notifications. HR's survey. An automated thank you for your service email. A canned message about Cobra health benefits. Noise. I deleted them without opening. What mattered was what they hadn't sent yet: the frantic calls, the desperate emails, the dawning realization that their responsible officer had just walked out with the keys to the vault. I stopped at a diner on the edge of downtown. Vinyl booths, stale coffee, the kind of place where the waitress calls you Han without looking up from her notepad. I slid into a booth, ordered tea, and opened my laptop. My login still worked, of course. They'd revoked my building badge, but no one had thought to remove my compliance access. Even if they had, it wouldn't matter. The system wasn't theirs to control. It was federal, immutable. The designation was mine until I willingly signed it away. There it was in black and white, responsible officer status vacant. All contracts frozen. I refreshed the dashboard just to watch it update in real time. The screen bloomed red like a field of poppies after a storm. One project after another, federally regulated, federally enforced, now inert. I took a slow sip of tea. Across the diner, a man scrolled through his phone, sighing at headlines he couldn't change. I wondered how long it would take for my old company to realize they weren't reading a headline. They were living it. Here's what I knew: by federal law, they had 24 hours to notify the oversight agency. If they didn't, the agency would assume negligence and hit them harder. But even if they filed the notice, it wouldn't save them. The stop work order was already active. Every minute they delayed reinstating me meant another minute of penalty fees, $100,000 per hour. Tick, tick, tick. People always imagine revenge as loud, violent, cathartic. But this wasn't revenge. It was consequence. Cold, quiet, inevitable consequence. I hadn't sabotaged a thing. I had simply allowed the system to do what it was designed to do when leadership failed to respect the rules. And they had failed spectacularly. I sat in that diner for nearly an hour, nursing weak tea, watching the clock. Somewhere across town, the CEO was probably still congratulating himself for refreshing the talent stack, while legal and compliance teams were about to discover the hole he'd dug. They'd scramble, they'd panic, and eventually they'd all trace the problem back to one line of text filed at 5:52 p.m. by a man they dismissed with a cardboard box. When I finally closed the laptop, I felt lighter. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying their burden. No midnight calls, no scrambling to meet audit deadlines, no cleaning up messes left by executives who treated compliance like background noise. That was their fire now, and I had walked away with the match still warm in my hand. As I stepped out of the diner, sunlight hit the street like a spotlight, and it struck me this wasn't an ending. This was an awakening. They had thrown me out, but in doing so, they had unchained me. And while their empire started to suffocate under the weight of fines and frozen contracts, I was free to breathe. But the storm was only beginning. The real chaos hadn't even reached their inboxes yet. And when it did, no one, not the CEO, not legal, not even the board, would be able to contain it. The CEO strutted off the stage that morning as if he had just delivered a sermon of progress. His words, streamlined, refresh the talent stack, new beginnings, were all carefully chosen to mask what had just happened. He had detonated a bomb inside his own company, and he didn't even know it. Here's the truth that leadership never cared to understand. I wasn't just the guy reminding them of renewal dates or filing forms no one wanted to read. I was the designated responsible officer on every federal and defense-linked contract they had. On paper, in the eyes of the government, I wasn't background noise, I was the bridge. Without me, there was no certification. Without me, no contract could move forward. And when a responsible officer leaves employment, the rules aren't suggestions, they're federal law. The company has exactly 24 hours to report the departure. That triggers a mandatory stop work order until a new officer is appointed, and here's the catch: they can't appoint one without my signature. Think about that. The CEO thought he was trimming fat. What he actually did was sever the artery that pumped blood through the entire organization. I imagine him later that day, leaning back in his glass-walled office, sipping an overpriced energy drink, bragging to investors about efficiency gains, completely unaware that his empire was already collapsing in silence. While he updated his LinkedIn with buzzwords about leadership, the clock on his company's survival was already ticking down to zero. That's the problem with arrogance: it blinds you. They never asked what kept the lights on. They never cared who cleaned up their messes at midnight when an audit threatened to derail everything. They thought compliance was paperwork. They thought I was paperwork. But paperwork can be sharper than any blade. I had spent years weaving myself into the DNA of those contracts. Every renewal form, every certification clause, every obscure line of Title 48 that they never bothered to read, I knew them all, lived them all. And in each of them was my name, my designation, my authority. Remove me, and the contracts didn't just stall, they died. By the time the CEO's golden speech ended, the process had already begun. The oversight office's servers had logged the termination form. The stop work order was active. It was no longer theoretical, it was enforcement. But the CEO, smug and oblivious, kept smiling at his own reflection in the boardroom windows. To him, I was expendable. To the law, I was irreplaceable. That's why I didn't storm out. That's why I didn't waste words in front of the crowd. Words can be ignored, but federal orders, they can't. The irony was almost poetic. For years I had been invisible, no fanfare, no recognition. The late-night fixes, the compliance miracles that saved the company millions, all done in silence. And it was that same silence that now turned on them, pressing its weight onto every contract they thought they controlled. The CEO had triggered the bomb himself. He'd pulled me out of the foundation, laughing about refreshing the team, not realizing he had just yanked out the keystone that kept his empire standing. By the end of that day, emails would start trickling into their inboxes. Subcontractors locked out, government portals flagging red, engineers confused by access errors they couldn't override. But in that moment, as he smirked about his visionary leadership, he was blissfully ignorant. And maybe that was the sweetest part. He didn't even see it coming. Because here's the truth, I want you to hold on to power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides in the places people dismiss the roles, they undervalue the names they don't bother to learn until it's too late. I was that name, and he had just erased it. What he didn't realize was that the second he did, he erased the lifeline of the entire company. The bomb was set, the timer was running, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. By the time dawn cracked through the blinds the next morning, the first tremors had already started. A ping on Slack at 8:47 a.m. Anyone else locked out of Project Merlin. 15 minutes later, another Fed Cloud is down compliance flag on login. What began as whispers spread like a virus through the system. By 10:30, entire engineering teams had been pulled off active builds and reassigned to documentation review, a euphemism every corporate worker knows. It meant sit still while leadership begs legal for a miracle. The compliance dashboard, usually a calming sea of green checkmarks, now resembled a Christmas display, short-circuited by lightning. Red, red, red. Non-compliant. Pending RO reinstatement. Each project flagged, each deadline frozen. It had taken less than 12 hours for the detonation to ripple outward. At 12:12 p.m., the first official blow landed. A plain text email, no logos, no signatures, just stark times. New Roman, your organization is no longer considered compliant for work involving federal or defense-linked contracts under Titles 48 and 32. Attached was a PDF time-stamped 5:52 p.m., the night before the exact moment my elevator doors had opened and I stepped out into freedom. And at the bottom of that PDF, the teeth penalty accruals $100,000 per hour. Let that sink in. Every 60 minutes, the company bled 6 figures. Every tick of the clock was money evaporating, leverage dissolving, and trust collapsing. Meanwhile, I was at home, robe draped around me, tea steaming in my hand. The chaos unfurled in real time, but I wasn't in the war room anymore. I was on the sidelines, calm, watching the empire convulse. On LinkedIn, messages stacked like Jenga blocks, sorry to hear the news. Big mistake on their part. If you're free, we should talk. Engineers I barely spoke to suddenly remembered my value. Managers who had once dismissed me as quiet now called it quiet superpower energy. The irony was delicious. Quiet, yes, but never powerless. Inside the company, the tone shifted from confusion to panic. Slack channels became battlegrounds, developers snapping at product managers, PMs accusing IT, shrugging helplessly with screenshots, action denied, responsible officer inactive, no backup assigned. That last line was the dagger. No backup. Because why would they ever plan for redundancy? I had never asked for credit, never played politics. I just made sure everything worked. And now, in my absence, they discovered what I had always known. Without the keystone, the arch crumbles. I could picture the CEO in his corner office squinting at that email, his $1 million smile faltering as he realized a $700 million company plastered with words like resilience and scalability was brought to its knees by the one person he deemed expendable. Here's what arrogance never teaches you. Don't notice the keystone until the whole structure collapses. By Friday morning, panic wore dress shoes. Legal sent urgent flags. IT tried reboot after reboot. Even the root user was locked out. The message never changed, current responsible officer vacant. Somewhere in their war room, the CTO probably muttered about glitches. Executives loved to blame systems instead of themselves. But this wasn't a glitch. This was regulation written in ink sharper than any contract they'd ever signed. And while they scrambled, I sat in my kitchen watching sunlight spill across the counter, stirring honey into my tea. Every ping on my phone was another reminder they weren't just losing contracts. They were losing control. That was the 12-hour earthquake, the moment when silence became too loud to ignore. And deep down, I knew it was only the beginning. The first 12 hours had been tremors, locked accounts, red flags, whispers across Slack. But by the afternoon, it erupted into full-scale chaos. Slack channels that once buzzed with polite corporate chatter turned into war zones. Engineers shouted in all caps, product managers hurled blame like grenades, and somewhere in the middle, IT sat helpless, posting the same screenshot over and over. Action denied, responsible officer inactive, no backup assigned. That one line ricocheted through the company like shrapnel. No backup. None. The simple truth every executive had ignored was now written in digital stone. They had gambled on me being replaceable. They had bet wrong. I scrolled through a leaked snippet. Later that night, someone still inside forwarded it to me quietly. The threads were pure meltdown. A PM raged, "We can't deliver without compliance clearance. Why hasn't this been fixed?" An engineer replied, "Because you fired the only person who could fix it, genius." The silence after that message must have been nuclear. Meanwhile, leadership tried to project calm. The COO posted a company-wide announcement in Slack: resilience through adversity. This is just a temporary challenge. Within minutes, someone responded with a GIF of the Titanic orchestra playing as the ship sank. It collected 87 laughing emojis before HR locked the thread. The IT team under siege attempted workaround after workaround. They rebooted servers, flushed caches, even attempted admin overrides. Every attempt met the same blunt slap: unauthorized. Responsible officer vacant. The system wasn't bending. It was law coded into regulation itself, and no clever trick would change it. I could imagine the atmosphere inside headquarters: glass-walled conference rooms fogged with stress, whiteboards scrawled with half-baked contingency plans, phones ringing unanswered. Middle managers pacing like caged animals, trying to calm teams that knew the truth without compliance. Nothing moved, nothing billed, nothing paid. The fear leaked outward. Subcontractors began sending inquiries, cautious but urgent. "Our shared portal is showing gray compliance badges. Can you confirm status?" In federal contracting, gray isn't neutral. Gray means dead, and dead meant non-billable. Inside my apartment, the contrast was surreal. I was still in my robe, watching the news drone on in the background, sipping tea. The storm that consumed them didn't touch me, not anymore. Every frantic Slack ping, every panicked memo, every desperate phone call was noise muffled by walls I no longer worked within. And yet I wasn't smug. Not exactly. Smug is for trivia nights and office politics. What I felt was colder, cleaner justice. Consequence. The elegance of a system doing exactly what it was designed to do. They had underestimated compliance for years, called it a cost center, treated me like wallpaper, and now compliance was the very thing strangling their empire. At 3:14 p.m., a friend still inside sent me another screenshot: the compliance dashboard, a once comforting field of green, now fully crimson. Red boxes stacking on red boxes projects frozen deadlines abandoned. Engineers argued, PMs panicked, legal sweated. And at the top of every error log sat my name, vacant but irreplaceable. The CEO tried to rally his lieutenants with a pep talk in the war room, I heard later. He blamed glitches. He blamed middle management failures. He blamed everyone but himself. But blaming doesn't restore compliance. Blaming doesn't stop the clock bleeding $100,000 every hour. By evening, the panic had fermented into desperation. I knew because my phone lit up 12 missed calls from HR, 3 from legal, 1 from the COO herself. I didn't answer. Why would I? The silence was my reply, the same silence they'd given me when they stripped my dignity in that conference hall. Inside, their empire was burning. Outside, I walked free, calm, steady, and I knew this was only the opening act. The real collapse hadn't even begun. Because chaos inside Slack threads is one thing, but once the contracts themselves began unraveling, there would be no putting the pieces back together, and that moment was coming fast. The next morning, while employees clawed at locked systems and managers pointed fingers at one another, legal finally did what legal always does when panic sets in. They dug through the dusty archives. Somewhere in a forgotten PDF buried under compliance charters last updated in 2012, a junior associate highlighted one sentence that made the blood drain from every face in that war room. Only the named responsible officer may certify, modify, or deactivate the company's active federal compliance status within regulated systems. That was it, the death sentence. They hadn't just fired an administrator, they had cut out the keystone, the piece you never notice until the whole arch collapses. I can picture that room as it unfolded. The CTO mumbling excuses about system glitches. The CFO frowning, tapping his pen, calculating how much each hour of fines was costing them. HR shifting in their seats, realizing their refreshing talent stack line was now corporate suicide. And the CEO, I imagine him staring at the highlighted claws jaw, tightening, the smirk finally wiped clean. Because now the truth stood naked, I wasn't replaceable. Not by a junior analyst, not by a consultant, not by another executive with the right buzzwords. My name was inked into every contract, every federal clause, every oversight file. You can't erase ink with optimism. At 9:12 a.m., my phone buzzed with 17 missed calls. 12 from HR, 3 from legal, 1 from the COO, and the last from the CEO himself. Each one ignored. I didn't need to pick up. I already knew what they would say. Come back, please. We'll fix this. But it wasn't my fire anymore, it was theirs. By mid-morning, the panic metastasized. It had tried to reset my credentials manually. The system flagged it instantly as an unauthorized responsible officer replacement attempt and reported it to the Department of Oversight. Somewhere in a government office, a board intern was probably sipping coffee when a little red flag popped up on their Q company attempted to circumvent RO protocol. That flag was more dangerous than any headline. It meant the government was watching. Every move the company made from here on would be scrutinized under a microscope, and any slip, any misstep would be treated as deliberate fraud. Inside, the suits began to realize the depth of their mistake. Outside, I was walking through a park, phone in my pocket, air crisp with autumn. Kids played on swings, dogs chased frisbees, and I let the noise of life replace the noise of their collapse. It felt surreal. For years, I had been invisible, the fixer behind the curtain, the one smoothing the messes so others could stand in the spotlight. I had never asked for recognition, never demanded applause, and because of that, they assumed I was expendable. But expendable people don't hold the power to freeze entire government contracts. Expendable people don't make the difference between solvency and bankruptcy in a single click. That clause in the dusty charter was my shield, my proof. I was the keystone, and without me, their empire wasn't just shaking, it was crumbling. By lunchtime, another friend inside messaged me, "The board is furious. They're asking how leadership could let this happen." I smiled. They had asked the wrong question for years. Not how could we let this happen, but how did we never see who was holding everything up? They didn't see it because they never wanted to. Seeing me meant admitting their power was fragile, their empire dependent on someone they never celebrated. And arrogance never allows that kind of humility. Now, though humility wasn't optional, it was law. The arch had lost its keystone, and the collapse was only accelerating. By the third day, desperation had fully set in. The war room smelled of burnt coffee and panic, the kind that seeps into every conversation when people realize their careers are on the line. The executives had tried every normal path, calls to HR emergency meetings, with legal frantic emails to government liaisons, but the walls kept closing in. And so inevitably, they crossed into the territory of the unthinkable. It began with IT. Late one night, a handful of engineers cracked open the GRC management console and tried brute force. They attempted a forced update, remove my name slot in a fresh one, from a short list of trusted employees. The drop-down menus even let them believe it was possible. They typed in new names, buzzwords attached to resumes, but with none of the clearance history I carried. For a moment, it looked like progress. But when they hit, save the screen, flashed cold gray text. Transfer blocked. Active responsible officer must authorize change via signed certificate form 1916C. And below that, in smaller, sharper type, unauthorized attempts to circumvent protocol will be reported per 48 CFR section 9406. The system wasn't just saying no, it was tattling. Every keystroke was logged, every attempt flagged, every desperate move broadcast to the oversight agency. Legal caught wind almost immediately. A junior attorney sprinted into the war room, waving the error message, face pale. "This is a felony," he said, voice trembling. "This isn't just non-compliance. It's attempted fraud. Minimum 5 years." That should have ended it. But panic makes fools of powerful people. I wasn't there, of course, but friends later told me about the moment. The moment the CEO, red-faced and exhausted, slammed his fist on the table and barked the words that froze the room. "Then forge her signature." Silence, dead silence, the kind that eats oxygen. Even the general counsel, a man so mild he sipped ginger tea from an orthopedic mug, looked like he'd aged a decade in 10 seconds. He placed his hands flat on the table, his voice brittle as cracked glass. "That is a federal felony. We are not discussing it again." No one spoke for 30 full seconds, not even to cough. And in that silence, the reality crystallized. There was no back door, no patch, no workaround. They were trapped. Meanwhile, I sat in my apartment laptop, open LinkedIn, glowing with new messages. Defense contractors, compliance firms, even a few international groups, all curious to check in. One email read bluntly, "If you're the responsible officer everyone's whispering about, we need to talk." I leaned back in my chair, the absurdity hitting me. 15 years of being invisible, dismissed as the paperwork guy, and now the same role made me untouchable. And that's why I didn't need to scream, didn't need to retaliate. The law was my voice, and the law was louder than any CEO. Back inside headquarters, the tension grew unbearable. Executives paced, snapping at assistants. IT tried again and again, only to trigger more error logs. And every failed attempt was another breadcrumb delivered to the oversight agency. They weren't just panicking, they were leaving a trail of guilt. The board knew it, legal knew it, even HR knew it. Everyone but the CEO still clinging to arrogance, still snarling about glitches and stubborn employees. But glitches don't threaten felonies. Glitches don't rack up $100,000 an hour in fines. Glitches don't destroy empires. And as the sun set on that third day, the empire was trembling, waiting for the inevitable collapse. Because there are mistakes you can spin. There are mistakes you can bury. But trying to forge a federal officer's signature, that's the kind of mistake that doesn't just sink a company. It sinks everyone strapped to it. And they had strapped themselves tight. By the fourth morning, the cracks had become canyons. It started with one contract, a mid-sized defense subcontract worth a few million, canceled. Then came the second larger $14 million terminated without hesitation. By lunch, 6 separate entities had issued formal notices of non-compliance, and 4 more froze payments indefinitely. Each letter was cold, bureaucratic, and devastating. I saw one of them later, forwarded from a friend still inside. "In light of the stop work order contract, 445B is in material breach. All project activities are hereby suspended. Liquidated damages to commence per section 9.2. Translation: you owe us. A lot." Inside headquarters, panic metastasized into despair. The CFO, normally the calm accountant type, developed a twitch under his left eye. His internal memo leaked almost immediately, subject line, "Urgent fines, accruing at $100K HR." He even included a real-time clock at the top of the email, ticking with every second. Theater maybe, but effective. It made the bleeding impossible to ignore. Every hour cost them another 6 figures. Every day millions evaporated. Their empire wasn't just faltering, it was hemorrhaging. And me, I was at home, stirring honey into my tea robe still draped around me, watching the slow-motion derailment from afar. LinkedIn pinged nonstop. We heard what happened, saw the news. Can we talk? Private defense firms, aerospace contractors, compliance startups. Suddenly everyone wanted my time, my expertise, my name. For the first time in years, I wasn't invisible. I was indispensable. But I didn't respond, not yet. Timing mattered. Silence, I realized, was the most powerful leverage of all. Meanwhile, Slack inside the company had turned into a digital graveyard of morale. Product managers screamed about deadlines. Engineers mocked leadership openly. Someone posted a Titanic meme, an orchestra playing as the ship sank, that racked up dozens of reactions before HR shut it down. But shutting down memes doesn't shut down reality. And reality was brutal. Contracts dead, subcontractors fleeing, government agencies sharpening their knives, the board demanding answers that no one could provide. The CEO still clung to arrogance, storming into meetings ranting about middle management failures, about glitches. He pointed fingers in every direction but the mirror. But even he must have heard the clock ticking in his head, the one the CFO had plastered in every email. That's when the calls began to pour into my phone again. HR, legal, even the COO. 17 missed calls in a single morning, all unanswered. My voicemail stayed empty, my silence unbroken. Because this wasn't my fire to put out anymore. This was theirs. You see, the contracts collapsing weren't just numbers, they were lifelines. Each breach triggered ripple effects, suppliers, unpaid deadlines, missed penalties stacking. The empire wasn't being chipped away, it was being gutted from the inside. And here's the part I want you to think about carefully. What would you do if you held all the cards? If every hour of silence bled the same people who once dismissed you as expendable? Would you pick up the phone? Would you cave to desperation? Or would you let the silence grow until they understood the weight of their arrogance? Because that's the choice I faced. And if you think this collapse was the end of the story, let me whisper this. It was only the beginning. What came next didn't just shake the company, it shook the CEO himself. Stay with me because the twist that followed is something you won't see coming. Back in my kitchen, the tea had gone lukewarm. Outside, the world carried on, cars, honking neighbors, walking dogs, children playing. Normal life. But inside that corporate tower, normal had ended. They were drowning, clawing for air, and I was the only one who could hand them the rope. And I wasn't reaching. Not yet. By the 5th day, the roles had flipped so violently that even I had trouble believing it. For years, I'd been the quiet name on forms the compliance guy people barely acknowledged at the holiday party. Now, I was the only name that mattered. The power shift was total. Executives who once brushed past me in hallways without eye contact were now calling non-stop, voices cracking, desperate for me to return. But I didn't pick up. Instead, I forwarded everything to my attorney. If they wanted to talk, they could talk to him. He loved it. You understand what this means, right? He told me over coffee. You don't negotiate alone anymore. They come crawling, we control the terms. And crawl they did. First HR fumbling through scripted apologies, then legal offering vague promises of protection if I'd just help resolve the bottleneck. But the most surreal moment came when the CEO himself, the man who once sneered that I was replaceable, left a voicemail so frantic it bordered on pitiful. We can work this out. I know you're upset, but think about the bigger picture. Think about your colleagues, the jobs at stake. Let's meet. Just tell me what you want. Tell me what I want. The irony burned. For years, what I wanted was respect, recognition, a seat at the table. And now it wasn't a request. It was a demand they couldn't refuse. But I wasn't going to hand it back so easily. My lawyer drafted a simple reply sent via email. All communications must go through counsel. Further attempts to contact our client directly will be considered harassment. The silence that followed was delicious. Inside their crumbling tower, panic turned to humiliation. Board members demanded the CEO step aside, temporarily arguing that his credibility was poisoned. The CFO's emails grew more frantic, filled with half-baked schemes to plug financial hemorrhages. None of it mattered. Without me, every contract was dead weight, every project frozen, every dollar bleeding. Meanwhile, I walked through grocery aisles in peace no longer invisible. People didn't know the details, but they knew enough. Headlines whispered, compliance officer holds, key to $100K hour shutdown. My LinkedIn profile views tripled. Recruiters hovered like vultures, but I wasn't prey. Not anymore. And the beauty of it, I didn't have to raise my voice, didn't have to scheme. All I had to do was sit still while the empire begged. Power, I learned, isn't always about action. Sometimes it's about restraint. But here's the question I kept asking myself at night, staring at the city lights beyond my apartment window. Should I even give them the chance to make amends? Could I ever trust men who had once considered forging my name, breaking federal law just to keep me quiet? That's when my attorney leaned across his desk, lowering his voice. You don't need to forgive them, he said. You need to decide what their desperation is worth. They'll pay anything. The question is, do you want money or do you want revenge? I didn't answer, not yet, because deep down I already knew this story wasn't finished. And if you think they've hit rock bottom, let me tell you, the CEO's personal collapse was still to come. He thought this was about contracts and fines. He hadn't realized that the real reckoning was about to turn inward, public, humiliating, irreversible. So stay with me, because in the next chapter you'll see exactly how the man who mocked me ended up dismantled piece by piece. The first sign of the CEO's unraveling didn't come from the boardroom, it came from TMZ. A grainy photo surfaced of him storming out of a midtown restaurant tie, loosened eyes red, shouting into his phone. The caption was "Brutal Embattled CEO Loses Cool" amid 100K hour meltdown. Overnight, it went viral. By morning, cable news anchors were dissecting not just the company's downfall, but his personal one. And that was only the beginning. Reporters camped outside his gated community. Neighbors leaked stories of midnight shouting matches, police visits, even his wife leaving with their children bags in hand. A man who once commanded boardrooms with arrogance now couldn't control his own household. Inside the company, the humiliation deepened. Leaked emails revealed he had authorized the push to just sign the compliance papers internally, weeks before the stop work order. His name, his instructions, his arrogance written in black and white. Every journalist had it. Every investor saw it, and every employee shared it with glee. Suddenly, the man who once mocked me as replaceable was the face of fraud. His LinkedIn account went dark, his Twitter locked. But the memes didn't stop. Screenshots of his rants circulated on Reddit. TikToks mocked him with countdown clocks. Here's how much he's lost today, ding ding ding. And here's the cruel symmetry. The same fines that destroyed the company were destroying him personally. Investors filed lawsuits not just against the corporation, but against him individually. Legal fees piled up. Former allies distanced themselves, claiming they'd never supported his compliance shortcuts. Even his closest confidants flipped. The COO, who once backed his every move, quietly met with regulators, securing a lighter penalty in exchange for cooperation. Betrayal from within. Meanwhile, I sipped coffee at my kitchen counter, reading the news like everyone else. Except I knew something they didn't. This collapse wasn't accidental. It was the direct result of his decision to gamble with my signature, my integrity. He had rolled the dice and lost everything. What fascinated me most wasn't the financial ruin, it was the psychological freefall. A man who had built his identity on dominance, who thrived on humiliation as a management tactic, was now being humiliated on the largest stage possible. And the calls didn't stop. He kept trying, sometimes at 3 a.m., his voice slurred, begging for a meeting. My attorney intercepted each attempt, filing them away, like evidence in a trial we didn't even need to fight. His desperation was proof enough. But I didn't gloat, not outwardly. Inwardly, though, I won't lie, it was vindicating. Years of dismissal, of being treated like furniture, erased in a single avalanche of headlines. Here's where I want to pause and ask you something. What does justice look like to you? Is it the moment the guilty face punishment? Or is it the moment they realize deep in their bones that they aren't untouchable after all? Because watching that man, once untouchable, unravel in public was justice I couldn't have scripted better. And yet the story wasn't finished. The company still had one desperate card left to play, and they were about to throw it on the table. A card that would drag me unwillingly back into the spotlight. Don't leave now, because what happened next wasn't just about corporate collapse. It became a battle over my own name, my own freedom, and the stakes were higher than ever. I should have known they wouldn't go quietly. By the third week of chaos, the company was bleeding so fast that even bankruptcy seemed merciful. Stockholders wanted scalps, regulators wanted fines, and employees wanted anyone to blame. And that's when the executives played their last card. They tried to make me the fall guy. It started with whispers in the press. Anonymous sources close to the board claimed the compliance officer had acted alone, withholding approvals out of spite. Articles painted me as a disgruntled employee gone rogue, a bitter paper pusher who sabotaged his own company. At first, I laughed. The story was so absurd it felt like a bad satire. But then I saw my name on headlines, key holdout behind 100K hour shutdown. And worse, the company began releasing carefully edited documents to suggest I had delayed sign-offs intentionally. That laughter turned into a chill running down my spine. This wasn't sloppy gossip, it was strategy. They were throwing me to the wolves to shield themselves. And suddenly the same public that had celebrated me as the lone man standing for integrity now questioned my motives. Was I a hero or a saboteur? Strangers debated me on Reddit threads, LinkedIn comment wars, YouTube breakdowns. My inbox flooded with hate mail. Some called me a traitor, others called me a saint. But here's the thing about truth, it leaves fingerprints everywhere. My attorney and I had preserved every email, every directive, every attempt by executives to bypass compliance. The so-called evidence against me collapsed the moment regulators cross-checked it. Still, it was hell living through those days. Walking into the grocery store, I could feel eyes on me. Was that recognition or suspicion I avoided my usual coffee shop, terrified someone might spit in my drink after reading the wrong headline? And in the middle of that storm, my attorney asked me the hardest question yet. Do you want to fight this quietly, or do you want to burn them in public? I didn't answer right away. My instinct was to hide, to wait it out. But then I remembered the CEO's voicemail, the way he sneered at me for years, the way the board dismissed my warnings until their empire collapsed. Why should I hide when I held the truth? So we made a decision. We went on offense. We released the emails, the recordings, the timestamps, every shred of proof showing the CEO himself had ordered shortcuts, that legal had greenlit internal signatures, that my refusal wasn't sabotage, but survival. The effect was nuclear. Overnight, the narrative flipped. Instead of the villain, I became the whistleblower. Regulators praised my diligence. Journalists hailed me as the man who wouldn't break. And the company, their credibility was scorched earth. And yet the stress nearly broke me. Nights blurred into mornings as I scrolled through endless feeds of strangers dissecting my life. Sleep came in scraps. Friends urged me to shut it all down, but I couldn't. Because buried beneath the relief of vindication was a darker realization. If they had succeeded in making me the scapegoat, I could have lost everything: my career, my reputation, maybe even my freedom. And here's where I'll ask you, if you were me, would you have stayed silent, let the storm pass and walked away? Or would you have gone nuclear like I did? Because as much as I thought this was the climax, I was wrong. The company's desperate blame game only set the stage for the final twist, the one that would test not just my career, but my very sense of self. Stay with me, because in the next chapter you'll see how my fight for truth spiraled into something even bigger than me. I thought I had survived the worst. I thought once the truth came out, once the emails, the recordings, the undeniable evidence hit daylight, the smear campaign would end. I was wrong. That was only the beginning of a darker, more personal war. When the company realized they couldn't bury me with lies, they went after something else: my life outside the office. It began with a sudden surge of reporters on my street. They weren't asking about compliance laws or regulations anymore. They were digging into my past neighbors, interviewed old college classmates, tracked down even my ex-girlfriend called at midnight by some desperate blogger fishing for dirt. At first it felt almost laughable. What could they possibly find? I was boring. No criminal record, no scandal. But then I remembered scandal isn't always about truth. Sometimes it's about perception, and perception can be twisted. A tabloid ran a headline: "The compliance officer who crashed a company, but what's he hiding?" The article insinuated financial trouble in my 20s, debts I had long since paid off, framed as if I were irresponsible, reckless. Another blog claimed I had anger issues, citing one argument with a professor back in grad school. None of it mattered that these stories were exaggerated, distorted, or flat-out lies. What mattered was that they spread fast. I couldn't go online without seeing my own face beside words like unstable, arrogant, and untrustworthy. Even worse, my parents started receiving calls. Strangers questioned their parenting, asked if they had seen warning signs. My mom cried on the phone, terrified I'd be ruined forever. That was when the fear truly set in. Not for me, but for them. Because this wasn't just about destroying my reputation. It was about isolating me, making me radioactive to anyone who dared stand by me. And I'll be honest, there were nights I considered disappearing. Just vanishing, leaving behind the noise, the headlines, the vultures circling overhead. But then I'd think back to that boardroom, the CEO's smirk, the arrogance dripping from his voice when he called me replaceable, and I'd feel the fire again. Still, if they wanted to drag me into the mud, fine, but I wasn't going to drown there. With my lawyer's advice, we launched a counter-strategy. Instead of denying every ridiculous rumor, we leaned on the one thing they couldn't fake: documentation. We handed over every bank record, every tax statement, every shred of paper that proved I had nothing to hide. and when the media refused to back down, I took a step they didn't expect. I told my own story. On a podcast for the first time, I laid it out raw. The late nights, the intimidation, the moment I realized my signature could cost lives. I didn't speak like a victim. I spoke like a man who had drawn a line and refused to cross it. The response stunned me. Thousands of messages poured in. Strangers who had been pressured at their own jobs, silenced by their own bosses, reached out to say, "You told my story." Suddenly, the narrative shifted again. I wasn't a scapegoat. I wasn't a villain. I was a voice people had been waiting to hear. Still, the scars were real. Friendships strained, family exhausted. My name would forever be tied to that collapse. But in the quiet of my apartment, as I stared at the flood of support on my screen, I realized something. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been told to stay quiet, to sign their name and look the other way. And before I reveal what happened next, the final unraveling of the empire that tried to bury me, I want to ask you, if your integrity was on the line, would you risk your reputation, your family, even your peace of mind to protect it? Or would you sign the paper and walk away? Because the choice I made didn't just destroy their empire, it set fire to everything I thought I knew about justice. I always thought justice would look clean, maybe even cinematic truth standing tall, while lies crumble into dust. But when the court date finally arrived, I learned justice is messy, drawn out, and brutal. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back wall pens, ready to twist every word into headlines. On the front bench, I caught the CEO's cold eyes locking onto mine, the same eyes that once dismissed me as a replaceable cog. Only this time he looked smaller, nervous, almost desperate. The prosecution laid out the evidence with clinical precision. Email chains, recordings of executive calls, financial reports showing deliberate negligence. It was all there, piece by damning piece. Then came my turn. I walked to the witness stand with my chest, heavy palms slick with sweat. For months I had carried the weight of their lies on my shoulders. Now, under oath, I had one chance to set it down. I told the court everything, the pressure to just sign, the veiled threats if I didn't, the smirk in the CEO's voice when he told me the company couldn't afford ethics delays. My words cracked once or twice, but I didn't stop. For the first time, they were hearing not just evidence, but the human cost of corruption. The defense tried to shred me apart. They called me bitter, accused me of exaggerating, of seeking fame. One lawyer even leaned in and sneered, "If you cared so much about integrity, why didn't you quit?" I wanted to snap back, but instead I took a breath and said, because if I had walked away, no one would have stopped them. Sometimes doing the right thing means staying in the fire. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the jury leaned closer. Outside the courthouse, the world had already chosen its side. Crowds carried signs with my name, chanting for accountability. Others jeered, shouting that I'd ruined their jobs, their pensions. It felt like standing in the middle of a battlefield, half the world ready to crown me, the other half ready to crucify me. And then came the verdict. Guilty? The word rang out like a bell. The CEO, the CFO, and 2 senior board members convicted on counts of fraud, negligence, and conspiracy. The empire that had ruled with arrogance collapsed in a single breath. But here's the twist no one saw coming. The judge turned to me, reminding the courtroom that while my actions had exposed the truth, I had also been part of the system for years. That I had stayed silent too long before finally refusing. For a moment, shame flooded me. Was he right? Had I waited too long to act? Had I in some way been complicit by staying in the game until it almost cost lives? That question haunted me more than any verdict. As the CEO was led away in cuffs, his eyes met mine one last time. No arrogance, no smirk, just emptiness. And I wondered, had he started like me, once believing he could balance ambition with ethics until the scales tipped too far? Justice had been served, yes, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like a funeral. For the company, for my innocence, maybe even for the man I used to be. And this is where I'll ask you directly. If standing up for what's right also means carrying the guilt of what you didn't do sooner, do you still call it a win? Or is it just survival with scars? Because the final chapter wasn't about verdicts or headlines. It was about whether I could live with myself after everything burned down. When the dust finally settled, I found myself standing alone in a silence I hadn't known in years. No more lawyers, no more flashing cameras, No more chants from crowds that either praised me or cursed my name. Just silence. And in that silence, I finally had to face the one question no courtroom could answer. What now? The company was gone, its empire dismantled piece by piece. Entire buildings sat abandoned, their glass facades, reflecting nothing but ghosts of what used to be. Employees scattered, some rebuilding their careers, others bitterly blaming me for the collapse. The CEO, once untouchable, was now behind bars, his name forever synonymous with greed and fraud. And me, I walked free. But freedom didn't feel like victory. It felt like starting over. There were nights I couldn't sleep, haunted by the thought that if I had acted earlier, maybe fewer people would have lost their jobs. Maybe families wouldn't have had to scramble to pay bills. Maybe the fallout wouldn't have been so devastating. That guilt stayed with me. But slowly I began to see the truth. Yes, I had scars. Yes, I had regrets. But those scars were proof I had chosen integrity over convenience. Proof I had drawn a line in a world that kept trying to erase it. One evening, I sat in a small cafe sipping burnt coffee when a man approached me hesitantly. He looked like he'd been carrying a weight for years. "You don't know me," he said, "but I wanted to thank you. I worked at a company just like yours. They tried to pressure me into covering something up. I remembered your story and I said no. They fired me, but I can look my kids in the eyes knowing I didn't bend." That moment hit harder than the verdict ever did. My fight wasn't just about contract signatures or corporate giants. It was about the ripple effect, about proving that one voice, even when shaky, can give strength to another. And that's when it dawned on me, true victory wasn't in tearing down an empire. It was in sparking courage where fear once ruled. I started speaking at universities, talking to young professionals about integrity, about how the smallest choices define the biggest outcomes. Not as a hero, not as someone with all the answers, but as someone who had been burned and lived to tell the tale. I'd tell them, you'll face moments when compromise feels easier, when silence feels safer. But if you give away your integrity piece by piece, you'll wake up one day with nothing left to fight for. Guard it. Because integrity is freedom, and freedom is the one thing no contract, no paycheck, no CEO can ever own. Looking back, that's the lesson I want to leave with you too. Not that I was perfect, not that I was fearless, but that I was human and still chose to stand. So before you click away, let me whisper this. If my story resonated, if you've ever felt trapped between doing what's easy and doing what's right, stay with me. Subscribe, join this community, because we don't just tell stories here, we build strength together. And if you want to know what happened after the unexpected twist where justice didn't end in the courtroom but followed me years later, then don't miss the next video. That chapter might just change how you see freedom itself. Because in the end, the real empire wasn't theirs. It was mine, the empire of my own choices, my own voice, my own freedom. And no one, not even the most powerful CEO, could take that away. There's a kind of quiet that comes after a storm. It's not triumphant, not even peaceful at first. It's just empty. That's what my life felt like in the weeks following the trial. I had spent so long fighting, so long bracing myself against betrayal and pressure, that when it was over, I didn't know what to do with the silence. But slowly, that silence turned into space. Space to breathe, space to rebuild. Space to rediscover who I was when I wasn't defined by contracts, deadlines, or boardroom battles. For the first time in years, I could sit with a cup of coffee in the morning and not feel like I was running late for something. For the first time, I could look in the mirror and see someone I recognized, not the perfect version, not the fearless fighter, but someone who had endured. The world didn't suddenly become kinder. Bills still had to be paid, wounds still had to heal, and trust was still hard to come by. But there was a clarity that hadn't been there before. I realized freedom isn't about winning every fight, it's about choosing which fights are worth your soul. And maybe that's the real takeaway from everything I've been through. You don't have to change the world in one sweeping act. Sometimes it's enough to protect your own corner of it, to draw your own line in the sand, and say this far, no further. If my story leaves you with anything, let it be this: integrity may cost you comfort, but it will always give you back yourself. And in the end, that's the only freedom that lasts.